Hello there, and welcome back to Real Conflict Zone. I'm your host, and before we dive into tonight's story, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Whether you're listening during your morning commute, taking a break from work, or settling in for the night, I appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us. If you're new to the channel, welcome to the community. We explore stories of mystery, the unexplained, and the extraordinary things that happen when reality itself seems to bend and break. If you find yourself drawn into what you're about to hear, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. And for those of you who've been with us from the beginning, your support means everything. Now, let's get into tonight's story, and I promise you, this one will keep you questioning everything until the very last word. They drove through fog and found a town not on any map. This is the story of the Chin family, and what happened to them on an October evening in Northern California when they took a wrong turn that shouldn't have existed, found a place that couldn't be real, and discovered that some destinations aren't meant to be reached. This is about the town at the end of the road, and why you should pray you never find yourself driving toward it when the fog rolls in and your GPS starts giving directions to nowhere. Michael Chun had been driving for 6 hours, and he was exhausted. His wife Sarah sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone with increasing frustration as she tried to find a signal that had disappeared somewhere around the last mountain pass. In the back seat, their 2 children, Emma who was 12 and Daniel who was 9, had finally stopped asking when they get there and had settled into that glazed silence that came from too many hours on the road and too much screen time on their tablets. They were supposed to be in Reading by now, supposed to be checking into a hotel with a pool where the kids could swim and burn off energy before the final leg of their drive tomorrow to Sarah's mother's house in Ashland, Oregon. It was meant to be a simple family trip, the kind they took every year around the holidays, a chance to reconnect with family and give the kids memories of long drives and new places. Michael worked as a software engineer in San Jose, Sarah was a high school English teacher, and they were the kind of normal, middle-class American family that you'd see in commercials or stock photos, nothing special, nothing that would mark them as the kind of people who'd stumble into something impossible. But then the GPS had done something strange. They'd been following Highway 5 North, the main artery that connected California to Oregon, when traffic had suddenly backed up. An accident ahead, the electronic signs had warned. Expect delays of 2 hours or more. Michael had groaned, Sarah had sighed, and the kids had immediately started complaining about being hungry and bored. So Michael had taken the next exit, figuring they could find a way around the traffic, maybe grab some food at a small town, then get back on the highway further north. That's when the GPS had recalculated, had shown him a route that cut through what looked like rural roads and small highways, a path that would save them almost an hour according to the estimate. Michael had hesitated, had learned from experience that GPS routes that looked too good to be true usually were, but Sarah had encouraged him, said they needed to get off the highway anyway, that the kids needed a break and so did she. So Michael had followed the GPS instructions, had turned onto a 2-lane road that led away from the interstate and into the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. For the first 20 minutes, everything had seemed fine. The road was well maintained, winding through forests of pine and oak, passing the occasional house or ranch. They'd driven through a couple of small towns, the kind of places with one gas station and a post office and maybe a diner that had been serving the same menu since the 1960s. The kids had perked up, interested in the change of scenery, pointing out cows and horses in the fields they passed. But then the fog had started to roll in. It came quickly, unusually quickly. One moment the late afternoon sun was filtering through the trees and the next moment they were driving through thick gray mist that reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet. Michael had slowed down, turned on his headlights, and felt a small knot of anxiety form in his stomach. Mountain fog could be dangerous, could hide curves and obstacles, could turn a simple drive into something treacherous. The GPS continued to give directions in its calm, automated voice, telling him to continue for 3 miles, then turn right onto Forest Service Road 47. Sarah had said that Forest Service roads were usually unpaved logging routes, not the kind of thing you wanted to take a family sedan down. But the GPS insisted, showed the route clearly on its screen, and Michael had figured that maybe the database was outdated, maybe the road had been paved since the maps were last updated. So he turned onto Forest Service Road 47, and for a moment his heart had sunk because Sarah had been right. The road was unpaved, just gravel and dirt that crunched under their tires. But then, maybe a quarter-mile in, the road surface had changed, had become smooth asphalt, recently paved from the look of it, with fresh yellow lines painted down the center. Michael had relaxed slightly, had told Sarah that the road must have been upgraded, that it was probably a shortcut that locals used. The fog had gotten thicker, had become so dense that Michael could barely see the road ahead, could only follow the yellow center line and hope that nothing was coming from the other direction. The trees on either side of the road were barely visible, dark shapes in the gray mist, and the silence inside the car had become oppressive. Even the kids had stopped talking, were just staring out the windows at the fog with expressions that suggested they were starting to feel uneasy. They'd been driving on this road for maybe 15 minutes when the GPS had announced their arrival, had said in its cheerful automated tone that they'd reached their destination. Michael had looked around, confused, because there was nothing here, just the road and the fog and the trees. No hotel, no town, no reason why the GPS would think they'd arrived anywhere. He'd been about to pull over and reset the navigation when Sarah had pointed ahead, had said something that made Michael's blood run cold. There were lights in the fog. Not headlights or streetlights, but something else. A warm golden glow that seemed to be coming from multiple sources, diffused by the mist into something that looked almost dreamlike. Michael had continued driving toward the lights slowly, cautiously, and as they'd gotten closer, the fog had begun to thin slightly, enough that they could start to make out shapes and structures. It was a town. A small town, nestled in what appeared to be a valley, though Michael couldn't see the surrounding hills through the fog. There was a main street with buildings on either side, and the warm glow they'd seen was coming from streetlights that looked old-fashioned, like the gas lamps from the 19th century but obviously electric. The buildings themselves were beautiful in a way that seemed almost unreal, Victorian-style homes with perfect paint jobs and manicured lawns, storefronts with large windows and hand-painted signs. Everything maintained to a degree that suggested either enormous wealth or obsessive attention to detail. Michael had driven slowly down the main street, and the first thing he'd noticed was that there were no people. The street was empty, not a single person visible anywhere, no one walking on the sidewalks or looking out from the windows of the houses. The shops all appeared to be closed, though lights were on inside many of them, creating that strange effect of spaces that were illuminated but uninhabited. There were cars parked along the street, nice cars, new models that suggested prosperity, but none of them showed any signs of recent use, no one getting in or out, no engines running. Sarah had leaned forward in her seat, staring out the windshield with an expression that mixed curiosity with growing unease. She'd asked what this place was, whether Michael had known there was a town on this route. Michael had said no, had never heard of any town in this area, and besides, the GPS hadn't shown any town on the map, had just marked this as their destination without any label or name. Emma had spoken up from the back seat, had said in a small voice that something felt wrong about this place, that it was too perfect, too clean, too quiet. Daniel had agreed, had said he wanted to leave, wanted to get back to the highway. Michael had felt the same way, had been about to turn the car around and drive back the way they'd come, when Sarah had pointed to something ahead. There was a sign at what appeared to be the far end of the town, a large wooden sign that looked hand-carved and professional, the kind of welcome sign you'd see at the entrance to a national park or historic site. But as they'd gotten close enough to read it, Michael had felt that knot of anxiety in his stomach tighten into something closer to fear. The sign read, "Welcome to Millbrook Valley, population 512. Established 1893. Sarah had pulled out her phone immediately, had tried to search for Millbrook Valley, but there was still no signal, no way to verify whether this place actually existed. Michael had stopped the car in the middle of the street, had put it in park, and for a long moment they'd all just sat there, staring at this impossibly perfect town that shouldn't exist and didn't appear on any map. The silence outside the car was absolute. No wind, no birds, no distant sounds of traffic or human activity. Just silence, thick and oppressive, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the quiet hum of the car's engine. The fog surrounded the valley like a wall, and now that they were inside it, Michael could see that it formed a distinct barrier, as if the town existed in a bubble of clear air surrounded by impenetrable mist. Michael had made a decision then, had told everyone they were leaving, that this place felt wrong and they needed to get back to the highway and find a normal town where they could stop for the night. Sarah had agreed immediately, relief evident on her face, and the kids had been even more enthusiastic, both of them saying, "Yes, please, let's go right now." Michael had put the car in reverse, had started to turn around in the empty street, when something had made him pause. There was movement in one of the houses. Just a flicker, a shadow passing in front of a lit window, but it was the first sign they'd seen that anyone actually lived in this place. Michael had found himself staring at that window, waiting to see if the shadow would reappear, if whoever was inside would come to the window and look out at them. But nothing happened. The window remained lit but empty, and after a few more seconds Michael had finished turning the car around and had started driving back the way they'd come. The drive out of town had felt longer than the drive in, though that was probably just Michael's imagination, his mind playing tricks on him because he was nervous and wanted to be away from this place. The perfect houses slid past his windows, the empty street remained empty, and the fog at the edge of town seemed to be waiting for them, gray and thick and somehow hungry. When they finally reached the fog and drove into it, Michael had felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as if they'd escaped from something dangerous, though he couldn't have explained what. They'd driven through the fog for what felt like forever but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, following the road back the way they'd come, watching for the turn that would take them back to the highway. But then something strange had happened, something that had made Michael's hands tighten on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. They'd emerged from the fog to find themselves driving down the main street of Millbrook Valley again, approaching from the same direction they'd entered the first time, the welcome sign visible ahead in the golden glow of those old-fashioned streetlights. Michael had stopped the car immediately, had felt his heart racing, had tried to understand how this was possible. They hadn't turned around, hadn't made any turns at all, had just driven straight back the way they'd come. There was no way they should be back in this town. Sarah had been gripping the door handle so hard her knuckles were white, and her voice had been shaking when she'd asked what was happening, how they'd ended up back here. Michael had said he didn't know, but they were going to try again, were going to get out of here one way or another. He'd turned the car around again, had driven out of town again, and this time he'd paid careful attention to the road, had watched the odometer to track how far they'd gone, had noted every curve in detail. They'd driven for exactly 2.3 miles through the fog before emerging back onto the main street of Millbrook Valley, approaching from the same direction for the third time. This time Michael had let the car roll to a stop right in the middle of the street, had put it in park, and had just sat there trying to process what was happening. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be possible. There was no way a road could loop back on itself like this without any turns or intersections. But it had happened, was still happening, and Michael had no explanation for it. Daniel had started crying in the back seat, soft, frightened sobs that broke Michael's heart. Emma had put her arm around her brother, but Michael could see in the rearview mirror that she was scared too, her eyes wide and her face pale. Sarah had turned to look at him, and Michael had seen something in her expression that he'd never seen before, a kind of primal fear that suggested she understood on some level that they were in serious danger, even if none of them could articulate what that danger was. Michael had taken a deep breath, had forced himself to think clearly, to approach this like a problem that could be solved with logic and analysis. He'd told everyone to stay calm, that there had to be an explanation, maybe something about the fog that was disorienting him, making him think they were going straight when they were actually making a big circle. Sarah had said that didn't make sense, that they would have felt the car turning, would have noticed the steering wheel moving. But Michael had insisted they try one more time, that he'd drive even more carefully, would make absolutely sure they were going straight. So they tried again, and this time Michael had driven at barely 15 miles per hour, his eyes locked on the road ahead, his hands steady on the wheel, making absolutely certain he wasn't turning. The fog had been just as thick, just as disorienting, but Michael had been sure he was going straight, had been completely confident that this time they'd break through and find the turn back to the highway. But when they'd emerged from the fog, they'd been back on the main street of Millbrook Valley, and this time something was different. The perfect town looked exactly the same, the buildings and streetlights and parked cars all in their places, but now there were people. Not many, maybe a dozen scattered along the street, standing on sidewalks or in front of shops, all of them facing the Chin family's car, all of them perfectly still, just watching. Michael had felt a wave of cold terror wash over him. The people weren't threatening, weren't doing anything aggressive, but there was something deeply wrong about the way they stood, the way they watched, the absolute stillness of their bodies. They were dressed normally, in casual clothes that wouldn't look out of place in any American town. But their faces were blank, expressionless, and even from a distance Michael could see that they weren't blinking, weren't breathing in any visible way, were just standing and staring with an intensity that felt inhuman. Sarah had started to say something, but her voice had come out as barely a whisper, and Michael had interrupted her anyway, had said they needed to get out of the car and look for another way out of town, that clearly the road wasn't going to work, so maybe they could go on foot, could climb up out of the valley and get above the fog. It wasn't a great plan, but it was better than sitting in the car and waiting for those impossibly still people to decide to do something. They'd all gotten out of the car, slowly, carefully, Michael's eyes never leaving the watching figures. He'd gone to the trunk and pulled out a flashlight they kept for emergencies, though the town was well lit enough that they probably wouldn't need it unless they went into the forest surrounding the valley. The air outside the car had been cold, colder than it should have been for Northern California in October, and it had smelled wrong somehow, like old paper and preserved flowers, the smell of a museum or a funeral home. The watching people hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to the family getting out of the car. They just stood there, their blank faces turned toward the Chens, their bodies perfectly motionless. Michael had counted them quickly, had seen maybe 15 or 16 people visible from where they stood, scattered along both sides of the main street. None of them were close enough to be an immediate threat, but their presence had transformed the empty town from merely eerie to actively terrifying. Michael had led his family down the street, away from the watching figures, heading toward what looked like it might be a path or trail leading up into the trees at the edge of town. Sarah had held Daniel's hand on one side while Emma walked close to Michael on the other, and they'd moved quickly but not running, not wanting to trigger whatever instinct or mechanism made the watching people react if they reacted at all. As they'd walked, Michael had looked more closely at the town, had noticed details that hadn't been apparent from inside the car. Every building was perfect, not just well-maintained but impossibly perfect, with no signs of age or wear, no chips in the paint or cracks in the sidewalks, no weeds growing in the flower beds or leaves on the streets, even though they were surrounded by trees that should have been dropping leaves this time of year. The windows of the shops and houses showed interiors that looked staged, like showrooms or museum displays, everything in its place and nothing that suggested actual human habitation. The cars parked along the street were equally strange upon closer inspection. They were new, or at least they looked new, various makes and models that you'd see in any American town, but they were all spotlessly clean, and when Michael had looked more carefully as they'd passed, he'd realized that none of them had license plates. Just empty spaces where the plates should have been, as if the cars were props rather than functional vehicles. They'd reached the edge of town and found what looked like a hiking trail leading up into the trees. Michael had glanced back toward the main street and had seen that the watching people had moved, had somehow relocated without any of the Chens noticing the movement, and were now standing closer, maybe 50 feet away, still watching, still motionless. Michael had felt panic rising in his chest, had grabbed Emma's hand and told everyone to move faster, to get on the trail and start climbing. The trail had been well-maintained, too well-maintained, like everything else in this impossible town. The surface had been smooth and clear, no roots or rocks or obstacles, as if someone had recently groomed it for hikers. They'd climbed quickly, Michael leading the way with the flashlight even though it was still light enough to see, Sarah bringing up the rear and constantly looking back to make sure they weren't being followed. After maybe 10 minutes of steady climbing, they'd reached a point where Michael had expected them to be above the fog, to be able to see the valley below and the surrounding landscape. But instead they'd found themselves walking into thicker fog, gray mist that closed in around them until they could barely see the trail beneath their feet. Michael had kept going, hoping they'd break through, but the fog had just gotten denser, and the temperature had dropped even further, and after another 5 minutes Michael had been forced to admit that climbing wasn't going to work either. They turned around and headed back down the trail, and when they'd emerged at the edge of town, the watching people had been gone. The main street was empty again, just as it had been when they'd first arrived. No sign that anyone had ever been there. Michael's car was still parked where they'd left it, and for a wild moment Michael had considered just getting back in and driving at the fog wall as fast as possible, hoping momentum would carry them through whatever barrier was keeping them trapped here. But before he could suggest that plan, Emma had pointed to one of the buildings, A large Victorian house that looked like it might have been the mayor's residence or some kind of civic building back when the town was first established. The front door was open, and there was warm light spilling out from inside, and something about that open door suggested invitation, suggested that whoever or whatever controlled this place wanted them to go inside. Michael had said absolutely not, had said they were not going into any buildings, were going to stay outside where they could run if they needed to. But then Sarah had pointed out that it was getting colder, that Daniel was already shivering, and they had no food or water except what was in the car, and if they were going to be trapped here for a while, they needed shelter. Michael had wanted to argue, but he'd known she was right, had felt the cold himself and seen how his children were starting to show signs of exhaustion and stress. So they'd approached the house carefully, Michael leading with the flashlight held like a weapon, though he knew it would be useless if whatever was waiting inside decided to be hostile. The front steps had creaked under their weight, the first normal sound they'd heard since entering this place, and somehow that creak had been more frightening than the silence, because it meant the place had physical properties, was real in some sense even if it existed in a space that shouldn't be accessible. The interior of the house had been warm, almost too warm after the cold outside, and it had been furnished like a Victorian-era home, with period-appropriate furniture and decorations that looked authentic, not the cheap replicas you'd see in a theme restaurant. The front hallway had led to a large living room with a fireplace where a fire was burning, real flames consuming real wood, and Michael had realized with a sinking feeling that someone or something had prepared this place for them, had known they were coming and had gotten ready. There had been a dining room adjacent to the living room, and on the table had been food. Not just any food, but a full meal, still hot, the kind of home-cooked dinner that Sarah made for special occasions, roasted chicken and mashed potatoes and green beans and fresh bread. The sight of it had made Michael's stomach turn, because how could anyone have known they'd be here? How could anyone have prepared this specific meal and timed it to be ready exactly when they walked through the door? But Daniel and Emma had been hungry, had started moving toward the food before Michael could stop them, and Sarah had said that if someone wanted to hurt them, there were easier ways than poisoning food, and they needed to eat something if they were going to keep their strength up. Michael had reluctantly agreed, had made the kids wait while he'd tested the food first, had taken small bites and waited to see if anything happened. When nothing did, when the food had tasted normal and hadn't made him feel sick, he'd let the family eat, though he'd remained on edge the entire time, waiting for something terrible to happen. After they'd eaten, exhaustion had hit all of them like a wave, the accumulated stress and fear and confusion of the past few hours finally catching up. The house had bedrooms on the second floor, and they'd found them already prepared, beds made with fresh linens, everything clean and ready. Michael had insisted they all stay in the same room, had moved the kids into the master bedroom and had set up his phone to record video pointed at the door in case anything tried to come in during the night. Sarah had asked what they were going to do, how they were going to get out of here, and Michael had admitted he didn't know. Nothing they'd tried had worked, and he didn't understand what was keeping them here or what this place even was. Sarah had suggested that maybe in the morning the fog would lift, maybe whatever was trapping them would be gone and they'd be able to leave. Michael had agreed, more because he needed to give his family hope than because he believed it, and they'd all settled down to try to sleep. Michael had stayed awake, sitting in a chair by the door with the flashlight in his lap, watching the video feed from his phone and listening for any sounds in the house. Hours had passed. The fire in the living room had burned down to embers, and outside the windows the town had remained lit but lifeless, those old-fashioned streetlights casting their warm glow over empty streets and perfect buildings. Sometime around what Michael guessed was 3 in the morning, he'd heard something. Not from inside the house, but from outside, a sound like footsteps on the sidewalk, multiple sets of footsteps moving in perfect synchronization. Michael had gone to the window carefully, had looked out, and had seen them. The watching people, dozens of them now, maybe 50 or more, all walking down the main street in formation, their movements perfectly coordinated, their blank faces turned forward. They'd been heading somewhere, moving with purpose, and Michael had tracked them until they'd turned a corner and disappeared from view. He'd stood at the window for a long time after that, his heart racing, wondering where those people had gone and what they were doing. But nothing else had happened, no sounds had come from inside the house, and eventually Michael had returned to his chair by the door and had waited for morning. Dawn had come slowly, the darkness outside gradually giving way to gray light that did nothing to dispel the fog still surrounding the valley. Michael had woken the family, had told them they were going to try again to find a way out, that they'd search the town systematically, looking for any path or road or trail they might have missed. Sarah had looked exhausted, had clearly not slept much, but she'd nodded and had started getting the kids ready. They'd left the house and had begun exploring the town, walking down streets they hadn't seen the night before, looking at buildings they'd only glimpsed from a distance. Millbrook Valley had been bigger than it had first appeared, with multiple residential streets branching off from the main street, all of them lined with perfect Victorian houses, all of them empty of people. They'd found a school, a church, a small library, all of them unlocked, all of them furnished and maintained as if they were in active use, but all of them completely deserted. In the library, Sarah had found books, and she'd pulled several off the shelves, hoping to find information about the town, about where they were and what this place was. But every book had been strange, the titles had been normal, but when Sarah had opened them, the text inside had been wrong. The words had been in English, the sentences had been grammatically correct, but they hadn't made sense, hadn't conveyed any actual meaning. It had been like reading something written by a computer that understood the structure of language but not its content. They'd continued exploring, had walked to what they'd thought was the far edge of town, and had found more buildings, more streets, the town extending further than should have been possible given the size of the valley they'd driven into. Michael had started to suspect that the town wasn't bound by normal geography, that it existed in a space that was larger on the inside than it should have been, like something from a science fiction story. At one point, Emma had pointed to a house and had said she recognized it, had said they'd passed it before, maybe an hour ago. Michael had looked and had realized she was right. It was the same house, with the same distinctive turret and the same color paint scheme. But that was impossible. They'd been walking in what Michael was sure was a straight line, hadn't circled back or retraced their steps. Yet here was the house again, proving that either Michael's sense of direction was completely wrong, or the town's geography didn't follow normal rules. They'd tried several more times to leave, had found different roads and paths leading away from the main part of town, but every one of them had led back to where they'd started, or had vanished into fog that was impenetrable, or had simply looped around in ways that made no geometric sense. By late afternoon, they'd been back, alive, that it was keeping them here for a reason they didn't understand yet. The days had started to blur together after that. They'd settled into a routine of sorts, staying in the house at night, exploring during the day, trying new methods of escape that all failed in different ways. The house had continued to provide for them, food appearing on the dining room table at regular intervals, always hot and fresh and exactly what they would have chosen to eat if they'd had a choice. Fresh clothes had appeared in the bedrooms in their exact sizes. The fire in the living room had never gone out, the wood somehow replenishing itself. They'd tried going different directions, had tried following the fog wall around the perimeter of the valley, had tried climbing trees to see if they could see anything above the fog layer. They'd tried damaging things, breaking windows and tearing down signs, to see if that would trigger a response from whatever controlled this place. Nothing had worked. The roads still looped impossibly, the fog remained impenetrable, and damaged things repaired themselves overnight. The broken windows whole again in the morning, the torn signs back in their proper places. The watching people had appeared more frequently, sometimes standing in groups at the edges of their vision, sometimes following them at a distance as they explored. They'd never approached closer than maybe 30 feet, never threatened or attacked, but their constant presence had been wearing on the family's nerves, especially the children. Daniel had stopped talking much, had become withdrawn and quiet, spending most of his time drawing pictures of the town with crayons they'd found in one of the houses. Emma had become clingy, rarely leaving Sarah's side, jumping at every unexpected sound. Michael had tried everything he could think of. He'd attempted to map the town, but the map never made sense, streets connecting in ways that violated basic geometry. He'd tried timing their walks, tracking how long it took to get from one place to another, but the times were inconsistent, sometimes taking 5 minutes to walk between 2 points and sometimes taking half an hour to cover the same distance. He'd tried leaving markers, objects placed at specific locations so he could track whether they were actually moving through a fixed space, but the markers moved on their own or disappeared entirely. On what Michael estimated was their 8th day in Millbrook Valley, though he'd lost track of time because days and nights seemed to be irregular lengths, something had changed. They'd woken to find that the house was different, subtly different in ways that had taken Michael several minutes to identify. The furniture was in slightly different positions. The pictures on the walls showed different scenes. The color of the curtains had changed from dark red to dark blue. It was like they'd woken up in a different version of the same house, similar enough to be recognizable but different enough to be unsettling. Sarah had noticed it too, had walked through the rooms with increasing distress, pointing out changes that Michael hadn't seen, small details that were wrong. The pattern on the dishes was different. The books on the shelves were different titles. Even the family photos that had appeared on the mantelpiece, photos that looked like they were of the Chen family but showed events and occasions that had never happened, were slightly different from the day before. It had been Daniel who'd said what they were all thinking, had looked up from his drawings and had said in a small voice that maybe they weren't in the same house anymore, that maybe the town was moving them around without them realizing it, putting them in different houses that looked the same but weren't. Michael had tried to reassure him that they were in the same place, but even as he'd said it, he'd heard the doubt in his own voice. That night, Michael had made a decision. If they couldn't escape Millbrook Valley through normal means, if the roads looped back and the fog was impenetrable and the geography made no sense, then maybe the answer wasn't to leave physically but to understand what this place wanted from them. The plaque had said, "May no one find what they seek here," which suggested that seeking something was part of the problem, part of what kept people trapped. Maybe if they stopped trying to escape, stopped seeking the way out, the town would let them go. He'd explained this theory to Sarah, and she'd looked at him like he'd lost his mind. She'd said that not trying to escape was the same as giving up, that they couldn't just accept being trapped here forever. But Michael had argued that they'd tried everything else, that nothing had worked, and maybe the town operated on rules they didn't understand, rules that required a different approach. Sarah had eventually agreed to try it his way, though Michael could see she didn't believe it would work. So the next day they'd stopped trying to leave. They'd walked through the town without purpose, without heading toward any exit or searching for any escape route. They'd explored buildings they'd already seen, had sat in the park near the gazebo, had acted like they were residents of Millbrook Valley rather than prisoners. It had felt wrong, had gone against every instinct that screamed at them to run, to keep trying, to never give up. But Michael had insisted they commit to the experiment, that they give it at least a full day to see if anything changed. Nothing had changed. The watching people still appeared at irregular intervals, still stood and stared with their blank faces and motionless bodies. The fog still surrounded the valley like an impenetrable wall. The roads still looped impossibly back on themselves. By the end of the day, Sarah had been angry, had accused Michael of wasting their time with foolish theories while their children suffered in this nightmare place. Michael had had no defense, had felt like a failure, had been out of ideas about what to try next. That night, Emma had woken up screaming. Michael and Sarah had rushed to her side, had found her sitting up in bed with tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking. She'd said she'd had a dream, that in the dream she'd been one of the watching people, had been standing motionless on a street corner while her family walked past without recognizing her. She tried to call out to them, tried to move, tried to do anything that would let them know she was still herself, but she'd been trapped inside a body that wouldn't respond, could only stand and watch as her family disappeared into the fog. Michael had held his daughter and had told her it was just a dream, that she was fine, that they were all going to get out of here together. But even as he'd said the words, he'd felt a cold certainty settling in his gut. The dream hadn't been random, hadn't been just Emma's subconscious processing her fear. It had been a message or a warning, or maybe a preview of what would happen to them if they stayed in Millbrook Valley too long. The watching people weren't statues or robots or some kind of supernatural entities. They were people who'd been trapped here before, who'd stayed too long, who'd been absorbed into whatever dark machinery kept this place running. The next morning, Michael had shared this theory with Sarah, and he'd seen in her eyes that she'd already come to the same conclusion. The watching people were former visitors, travelers who'd taken a wrong turn or followed bad GPS directions or gotten lost in the fog, and who'd never managed to leave. Somehow the town had claimed them, had transformed them into these blank-faced sentinels who stood guard over streets that led nowhere. Sarah had asked how long they had, how long before the town did the same thing to them. Michael had said he didn't know, but he'd noticed that Daniel had been talking less each day, had been becoming more withdrawn and quiet, and Emma's clinginess had gotten worse, had progressed to the point where she wouldn't let Sarah out of her sight for even a moment. And Michael himself had started to feel different, had noticed moments where his thoughts would drift and his mind would go blank, where he'd find himself standing still for minutes at a time without remembering deciding to stop moving. They'd been in Millbrook Valley for maybe 2 weeks now, though time had become so distorted that Michael couldn't be sure. What he was sure of was that they were running out of time, that whatever process transformed visitors into watching people was already starting to affect them, and if they didn't find a way out soon, they never would. That afternoon, Michael had made one final attempt to escape. He'd taken the car, had left his family in the house because he'd wanted to try something dangerous and hadn't wanted to risk them. He'd driven to the edge of town, had accelerated toward the fog wall, had pushed the car up to 60 miles per hour and had aimed straight at the gray barrier, hoping that speed and momentum would carry him through where slow, cautious driving had failed. The car had hit the fog wall, and for a moment Michael had felt resistance, like driving through something solid, and he'd thought maybe it was working, maybe he was breaking through. But then the world had twisted around him, had spun in a way that defied physics and geometry, and when everything had settled, he'd found himself driving down the main street of Millbrook Valley again, approaching from the same direction he always did, the car undamaged but his hope thoroughly crushed. He'd returned to the house and had told Sarah it was over, that they were trapped and there was no way out, that they needed to accept they were going to die here or worse, were going to become like the watching people, standing motionless on empty streets for eternity. Sarah had refused to accept that, had said they weren't giving up, that they had children who deserved to go home and live normal lives, and they were going to find a way out no matter what it took. She'd been right, of course. Michael had been ready to surrender, but Sarah had reminded him why surrender wasn't an option. They had Emma and Daniel to protect, to save, to get home safely. So Michael had pulled himself together and had started thinking again, trying to find some angle they hadn't explored, some approach they hadn't tried. It had been while examining his phone, scrolling through the photos he'd taken during their time in Millbrook Valley, that Michael had noticed something. The plaque in the park, the one that read, "May no one find what they seek here," there was something about the wording that had bothered him when he'd first read it, something his mind had flagged as important but that he hadn't been able to articulate. Now, looking at the photo again, he'd realized what it was. The plaque hadn't said, "May no one find what they want here," or "May no one find what they need here." It specifically said "seek," which suggested that the act of seeking itself was the problem, was the mechanism that kept people trapped. But what if they sought something different than escape? What if they sought something the town wanted them to seek, something that would satisfy whatever requirement needed to be met before visitors could leave? Michael had shared this new theory with Sarah, and together they tried to figure out what the town might want them to seek. The watching people performed their synchronized rituals at the gazebo, which suggested that location was significant. The plaque mentioned those who remain and those who were lost and those who watch, which suggested 3 different categories of people, 3 different states of being within the town structure. Sarah had suggested they try seeking the watching people themselves, try to communicate with them or understand them rather than avoiding them or running from them. Michael had agreed, and that evening when the watching people had appeared on the streets, Michael and Sarah had approached them, not with fear or hostility, but with curiosity and compassion, treating them as people who were trapped just like the Chun family was trapped. The watching people hadn't reacted at first, had maintained their usual stillness and blank expressions. But Michael had spoken to them anyway, had said that he understood they'd been trapped here just like his family, that he wanted to help them if he could, that maybe by working together they could all find a way to escape. And as he'd spoken, he'd seen something flicker behind the blank eyes of the nearest watching person, some hint of consciousness or awareness that suggested there was still someone inside that frozen exterior. Sarah had joined in, had started talking to another watching person, a woman who looked like she might have been a mother herself, who might have once had a family she'd been trying to protect. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the watching people had started to change. Their blank expressions had developed subtle variations. Their perfect stillness had given way to small movements, shifts of weight and adjustment of posture that suggested they were becoming more human, more themselves. Then one of them had spoken, not in the strange chorus they'd used during their ritual at the gazebo, but in a normal human voice, rusty from disuse but unmistakably real. The watching person had said a single word, "help," and that word had broken whatever spell or mechanism had been keeping them frozen. One by one, The watching people had started to move more freely, to speak more clearly, to remember who they'd been before Millbrook Valley had claimed them. They'd told their stories. Dozens of people who'd arrived at Millbrook Valley over the years, maybe over the decades, each one trapped by the same impossible geography and impenetrable fog. They'd tried to escape, had exhausted themselves with failed attempts, and eventually the town had claimed them, had transformed them into the watching people who stood guard over empty streets. But they'd still been conscious inside their frozen bodies, still aware but unable to control their actions, forced to stand and watch as new visitors arrived and failed to escape just as they had failed. Michael had asked if any of them knew how to leave, if anyone had found a way to break free of the town's hold. One of them, a man who said he'd been trapped in Millbrook Valley since the 1980s, had explained that the town fed on seeking, on the desperation and fear of people trying to escape. The more you tried to leave, the more you sought the way out, the stronger the town's hold became. But the town couldn't hold people who weren't seeking anything, who had accepted where they were and found peace with their situation. The problem was that acceptance was nearly impossible when you knew you were trapped, when every instinct screamed at you to run and keep trying. The town had been designed that way, had been created by someone or something that understood human psychology well enough to create a perfect trap. The only people who'd ever escaped, the man had said, were the ones who'd genuinely stopped caring about escape, who'd reached a state of such complete acceptance that the town had lost its hold on them. Sarah had asked how anyone could reach that state, how you could trick yourself into not caring about something that mattered more than anything. The man had said you couldn't trick yourself, couldn't fake it, the acceptance had to be real and genuine. But he'd also said that maybe, if everyone trapped here worked together, if all the watching people and the Chin family pooled their will and intention, maybe they could create enough collective acceptance to weaken the town's hold long enough for someone to escape. It wasn't a guarantee, wasn't even a strong probability, but it was more hope than any of them had had in a long time. So they'd made a plan. All the watching people, nearly 100 of them now that they'd been freed from their frozen state, would gather at the gazebo and would perform a kind of meditation or ritual, focusing on acceptance and peace and letting go of the desperation to escape. And while they did that, while they distracted the town's attention with their collective will, the Chun family would make one final attempt to drive out through the fog. They'd waited until what passed for dawn in Millbrook Valley, that gray light that never quite became full daylight. The watching people had gathered at the gazebo, had formed their circle around the stone pedestal, and had begun their meditation. This time when they'd spoken in unison, their voices hadn't been alien or frightening but beautiful and sad. A chorus of people who'd lost years or decades to this place, but who were willing to sacrifice their own chance at freedom to help a family they barely knew. Michael had loaded his family into the car, had started the engine, and had driven toward the fog wall one final time. As they'd approached, he'd felt the same resistance he'd felt before, that sensation of driving into something solid rather than through empty air. But this time the resistance had been weaker, had felt more like pushing through heavy curtains than like hitting a wall. The car had slowed but hadn't stopped, had continued forward inch by inch, and Michael had pressed the accelerator harder, had poured every bit of will and determination into getting through this barrier. The fog had been so thick they couldn't see anything, not the road ahead or the trees on either side or even the hood of their own car. Michael had driven by faith and instinct, trusting that if they could just get through this barrier they'd find the normal world on the other side. Sarah had held both children close in the back seat, all three of them silent and tense, waiting to see if this final attempt would succeed or if they'd emerge back onto the main street of Millbrook Valley like every other time. And then the fog had begun to thin. Not suddenly but gradually, the gray mist giving way to clearer air, and through the windshield Michael had started to see shapes that looked like normal trees, normal roads, normal reality. The car had burst out of the fog bank completely, had emerged onto a dirt road that looked like it might actually lead somewhere, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael had felt genuine hope. He'd driven for another 10 minutes, following the dirt road until it had connected with a paved highway, and then he'd driven further still, putting distance between his family and Millbrook Valley, not willing to stop or slow down until he was absolutely certain they'd escaped. It wasn't until they'd seen a road sign indicating they were approaching the town of Weed, California, a real town that appeared on maps and had real people living in it, that Michael had finally allowed himself to believe they were free. He'd pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of Weed, had parked the car and had just sat there shaking, the accumulated stress and fear of the past weeks finally releasing now that they were safe. Sarah had been crying in the back seat, holding both children, and Emma and Daniel had been crying too, all of them overwhelmed by the relief of escape. After they'd collected themselves, after Michael had filled up the gas tank and bought snacks and drinks from the station's convenience store, they'd called Sarah's mother and had told her they'd been delayed but were okay and would be there by evening. They hadn't explained about Millbrook Valley, hadn't tried to describe what they'd experienced, because how could they explain something they barely understood themselves? They'd driven the rest of the way to Ashland without incident, had arrived at Sarah's mother's house and had spent the evening, pretending everything was normal, that they just had a regular road trip with regular traffic delays. But that night, after the kids had gone to bed and Sarah's mother had retired to her room, Michael and Sarah had sat up late talking about what they should do with what they'd experienced. Should they report it to someone? Try to warn other travelers about the danger of taking wrong turns in that area? Try to go back and help the watching people who'd sacrificed their chance at escape to help the Chin family? Or should they just try to forget it ever happened, try to move on with their lives and put Millbrook Valley behind them? In the end, they'd decided they had to try to do something. Too many people were trapped there. Too many lives had been stolen by that impossible place. So after they'd returned home to San Jose, after they'd settled back into their normal routines and had helped Emma and Daniel process what they'd experienced through therapy and family discussions, Michael had started researching. He tried to find Millbrook Valley on maps, both modern digital maps and old historical maps, but there'd been no record of any town by that name in Northern California. He'd searched for missing persons reports from the area, figuring that if 100 people were trapped in Millbrook Valley, some of them must have been reported missing by their families. He'd found dozens of reports over the past 50 years, people who'd vanished while traveling through Northern California, cases that had never been solved because there'd been no evidence of what had happened to them. Michael had contacted some of the families, had tried to explain what he'd discovered, that their missing loved ones might still be alive in a place that existed outside normal geography. Most had thought he was crazy, had hung up on him or had threatened to call the police if he contacted them again. But a few had listened, had seemed to understand that he was telling the truth, and had asked how they could help. Together, this small group of people who'd lost family members to Millbrook Valley had started planning. They'd decided to organize a search, to go back to the area where Michael had found the town, to try to locate it again and to document its existence. If they could gather enough evidence, if they could prove that Millbrook Valley was real and was trapping people, maybe they could get official help, could get search and rescue teams or even military resources devoted to freeing the trapped residents. 3 months after their escape, Michael had led a group of 7 people back to Northern California. They'd driven the same route he'd driven with his family, had taken the same exit off Highway 5, had followed the same roads into the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. They'd driven for hours, looking for Forest Service Road 47, looking for the place where the fog had closed in and the GPS had led them to impossible destinations. They hadn't found it. The roads were all there. The towns they'd passed through on the way to Millbrook Valley were all where they should be. But Forest Service Road 47 either didn't exist or wasn't where Michael remembered it being. They'd tried different routes, had explored every side road and forest access point in a 50-mile radius, had driven through fog banks hoping they'd emerge in that valley with its perfect Victorian houses and silent streets. But Millbrook Valley was gone. Or it had never been there in a way that could be reliably accessed. Or it only appeared to certain people at certain times, and the Chen family had simply been unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The other families in Michael's search group had been disappointed. Some had accused him of making up the whole story, but Michael had known what he'd experienced had been real. The watching people had been real. The impossible geography had been real. The weeks his family had spent trapped in that nightmare place had been absolutely real. So Michael had tried a different approach. He'd gone to the police in the nearest town to where he thought Millbrook Valley had been, had filed a report about his experience, had provided as much detail as he could remember. The officer who'd taken his report had been polite but skeptical, had clearly thought Michael was either mentally ill or making up an elaborate hoax. But the officer had said he'd file the report anyway, would add it to the database, and if anyone else reported similar experiences, they'd have Michael's account on record for comparison. Over the next few months, Michael had continued his research and outreach, had built a website documenting everything about Millbrook Valley, had posted his story and invited others who'd had similar experiences to share theirs. A few people had responded, had told stories that were eerily similar to the Chun family's experience, other families or solo travelers who'd gotten lost in various parts of the country and had found themselves in impossibly perfect towns that wouldn't let them leave. The details varied. The towns had different names and different architectural styles, but the core elements were always the same. Impossible geography, roads that looped back on themselves, fog or mist that formed impenetrable barriers, watching figures that stood motionless until something triggered them to move. And in every case, the people who'd escaped had only managed to do so by letting go of their desperation, by finding some way to accept their situation long enough for the trap to loosen its hold. Michael had started to understand that Millbrook Valley wasn't unique, wasn't a single location but rather a type of place, a phenomenon that appeared in different locations under different names. These places were like pocket universes, spaces that existed adjacent to normal reality but operated under different rules, traps designed to catch travelers and hold them indefinitely. And they were rare enough that most people would never encounter them, but common enough that hundreds or maybe thousands of people had vanished into them over the years without anyone understanding what had happened. The question that haunted Michael was why these places existed. Were they natural phenomena, strange quirks of quantum physics or dimensional topology that created spaces where the normal laws of reality didn't apply? Were they artificial, created by some intelligence or organization for purposes Michael couldn't fathom? Or were they alive in some sense, entities that fed on human fear and desperation, that sustained themselves by trapping people in elaborate simulations of small-town normalcy? Michael didn't have answers, and he'd come to accept that he might never have answers. What he did have was a mission, a commitment to documenting these places and warning other travelers about the danger. His website had grown into a substantial resource, with reports from dozens of people who'd encountered these impossible towns, maps showing areas where encounters were more common, and advice for anyone who found themselves trapped in one of these places. The advice was simple but hard to follow. Don't panic. Don't try too hard to escape. Don't let the place feed on your fear and desperation. Accept where you are. Find peace with your situation, and the trap will loosen enough for you to slip free. It wasn't much, but it was all Michael had learned from his experience, and he hoped it would be enough to help future travelers avoid the fate of the watching people. Sarah had been supportive of Michael's mission, had helped him manage the website and respond to people who reached out with their own stories. But she'd also been clear that their children came first, that Emma and Daniel needed stability and normalcy after what they'd experienced. So Michael had balanced his research and outreach with his responsibilities as a father and husband, had made sure that his family's trauma didn't define their entire lives. Emma and Daniel had both been in therapy for months after their escape from Millbrook Valley. Emma had struggled with anxiety and nightmares, had developed a fear of fog and empty streets that took years to overcome. Daniel had gone mostly nonverbal for several weeks, had needed specialized therapy to help him process what he'd experienced and to start talking again. But both children had eventually recovered, had found ways to integrate their trauma into their life stories without being consumed by it. The Chun family had developed rules for their travels after Millbrook Valley. They never took routes that weren't on major roads. They never followed GPS directions that deviated significantly from known highways. They never drove through heavy fog if they could avoid it. And they never, ever stopped in small towns that felt too perfect, too quiet, too empty. These rules had limited their spontaneity, had made their trips more cautious and less adventurous. But the family had agreed that caution was a small price to pay for safety. Years had passed since their experience in Millbrook Valley. Emma had graduated high school and had gone to college, had become a psychology major with a focus on trauma and resilience, her career choice clearly influenced by what she'd experienced as a 12-year-old. Daniel had become an artist, had created a series of paintings depicting the town and the watching people, his art serving as a way to process and externalize his memories. Michael had continued his research, had built connections with other people who'd encountered these impossible places, and together they'd formed a kind of informal network, a community of survivors who supported each other and tried to make sense of what they'd experienced. They'd called themselves the Lost Towns Project, and their website had become a resource for researchers and investigators who were interested in anomalous phenomena. Some in the community believed the lost towns were government experiments, secret facilities designed to study human behavior under extreme conditions. Others believed they were supernatural in origin, places where the boundary between our world and some other realm had become thin enough for things to slip through. And others believed they were entirely natural, strange configurations of geography and topology that created psychological effects in travelers that made them perceive impossible things. Michael didn't claim to know which explanation was correct. What he knew was that these places were real, that they trapped people, and that understanding them was the first step toward helping people avoid or escape them. He'd given presentations at conferences on anomalous phenomena, had been interviewed by podcasters and documentary filmmakers, had even consulted with law enforcement agencies on missing persons cases that seemed to fit the pattern. But despite all his research and all his connections, Michael had never found a way back to Millbrook Valley specifically. The place seemed to have vanished completely, or perhaps it had simply moved, had relocated to some other stretch of back roads where it could continue catching unwary travelers. Michael had mixed feelings about this. Part of him wanted to go back, wanted to help the watching people who'd sacrificed their freedom to save his family. But another part of him was terrified of being trapped again, of losing his family to that place permanently. One evening, almost 10 years after their escape from Millbrook Valley, Michael had received an email that had changed everything. It was from someone who claimed to be one of the watching people, one of the residents who'd been freed briefly when the Chin family had spoken to them. The email had said that after the Chin family escaped, the watching people had remained mobile and conscious for several hours before the town's hold had reasserted itself and they'd been frozen again. But in those few hours of freedom, they'd learned something important. The town wasn't truly alive, wasn't an intelligent entity making conscious choices about who to trap and who to release. It was more like a machine, a system that operated according to specific rules, and those rules could be exploited by people who understood them well enough. The watching people had used their brief freedom to explore the town more thoroughly than any visitors had ever been able to, and they'd found something hidden at the very center of Millbrook Valley, beneath the gazebo where they'd performed their rituals. There was a structure there, buried underground, something that looked like it had been built rather than naturally formed. They'd only had time to partially excavate it before being frozen again, but what they'd found suggested that Millbrook Valley was indeed artificial, that someone or some group had created it deliberately, had built this trap and hidden it in a pocket of spacetime where it would continue operating indefinitely. The email had included coordinates, specific GPS coordinates that supposedly marked the exact location where Millbrook Valley could be accessed. The sender had said that the town cycled through different locations, appeared and disappeared according to patterns that the watching people had started to decipher. According to their calculations, Millbrook Valley would appear at these coordinates in exactly 2 weeks, on October 15th, between the hours of 6 and 8 p.m. If Michael wanted to go back, if he wanted to help free the watching people permanently, this would be his chance. Michael had shown the email to Sarah, and they'd argued about it for hours. Sarah had said it was obviously a trap, that whoever sent the email wanted to lure Michael back to Millbrook Valley so the town could claim him permanently. She'd reminded him of their children, of his responsibilities, of the fact that he'd already escaped once and shouldn't risk everything by going back. But Michael had felt compelled, had felt like he owed something to the watching people who'd helped his family escape, and he'd been curious about the structure they'd found, about the possibility of finally understanding what Millbrook Valley really was and how it had been created. So despite Sarah's objections, despite his own fear and better judgment, Michael had decided to go back. He'd assembled a small team from the Lost Towns Project, volunteers who'd had their own experiences with impossible places and who understood the risks. There were 5 of them in total. Michael, 2 other survivors of Lost Town encounters, and 2 researchers who'd spent years studying these phenomena without having experienced them directly. They'd equipped themselves with cameras and recording equipment, had brought supplies for an extended stay in case they couldn't escape quickly, and had made detailed plans for how to proceed once they arrived. On October 15th, at exactly 6 p.m., the team had arrived at the coordinates specified in the email. They were in Northern California, not far from where Michael had originally encountered Millbrook Valley, on a stretch of road that looked completely ordinary in the early evening light. They'd waited in their vehicles, engines running, watching for any sign of the fog or the town or anything else unusual. At 6:45 p.m., the fog had started to roll in. It had come from nowhere, had appeared as if materializing out of empty air, thick gray mist that quickly reduced visibility to almost nothing. The team had radioed each other, had confirmed they were all seeing the same thing, and then Michael had started driving slowly into the fog, following what appeared to be a road that hadn't been there moments before. The drive had been exactly as Michael remembered it. The same oppressive gray mist, the same sense of displacement and disorientation, the same sudden emergence into clear air and golden light. And there it was, unchanged after 10 years, Millbrook Valley spread out before them, its Victorian houses and perfect streets and empty sidewalks exactly as Michael had seen them in his nightmares for the past decade. The team had parked their vehicles near the gazebo in the center of town and had immediately started setting up their equipment. They'd placed cameras at strategic points, had started recording everything, had documented every detail of the town's appearance and layout. And they'd waited for the watching people to appear, hoping that the same method that had worked before, approaching them with compassion and trying to free them from their frozen state, would work again. The watching people had appeared within an hour, emerging from buildings and gathering on the streets, their blank faces and motionless bodies surrounding the team's position. Michael had approached them, had spoken to them as he had 10 years ago, had tried to trigger whatever mechanism allowed them to break free of the town's control. And slowly, gradually, it had worked. The watching people had started to move, to speak, to remember themselves. But this time, the watching people had been ready. Instead of using their brief freedom to help the team escape, they'd led Michael and the others to the gazebo, had shown them the excavation they'd started years ago. Beneath the stone pedestal with its bronze plaque, there was indeed a structure, metal and smooth and clearly manufactured. Together, the team and the watching people had worked to expose more of it, to understand what it was and how it functioned. What they'd found was something like a computer server, a piece of technology that seemed far more advanced than anything Michael had seen before. There were no obvious controls or interfaces, no buttons or screens or anything that suggested how it might be operated. But the researchers in the team had brought equipment that could detect electromagnetic fields and energy patterns, and they'd started mapping the structure's outputs, trying to understand its function. Over several hours of analysis, they'd developed a theory. The structure was generating what they called a spatial recursion field, a bubble of space-time that looped back on itself, creating the impossible geography that trapped visitors to Millbrook Valley. The field was powered by something the researchers called resonance extraction, essentially feeding on the emotional energy of trapped individuals, using their fear and desperation as fuel to maintain the spatial loop. The watching people had confirmed this theory based on their own observations over the years. They'd noticed that the town's hold on them was stronger when they were more distressed, when they struggled harder to escape, and weaker when they found moments of peace or acceptance. The town literally fed on human suffering, not in a supernatural or metaphysical sense, but in a concrete physical sense, converting emotional distress into energy that powered the field generator. The question had been how to shut it down. The structure had no obvious controls, and simply damaging it might have catastrophic effects, could potentially collapse the spatial bubble with everyone still inside it. The researchers had suggested trying to starve it instead, to have everyone in Millbrook Valley, all the watching people and the entire team, simultaneously achieve a state of perfect calm and acceptance, cutting off the field generator's power supply until it shut down on its own. It had sounded impossible, but they'd tried. All 100+ watching people and the 5 members of Michael's team had gathered in the center of town, had formed a massive circle around the gazebo, and had begun a meditation exercise designed to induce calm and acceptance. They'd focused on letting go of their fear, their anger, their desperate need to escape, and had tried to find peace with their current situation, at least temporarily. The effect had been immediate and dramatic. The golden light that suffused Millbrook Valley had begun to flicker and dim. The perfect buildings had started to show signs of age and decay, as if decades of neglect were suddenly catching up with them. The fog surrounding the valley had begun to dissipate, revealing landscape beyond that looked nothing like the Northern California forest they'd driven through to get here. And most tellingly, the watching people had started to fade. Not disappearing, but becoming transparent, their solid forms becoming ghost-like and insubstantial. They'd seemed to understand what was happening, had seemed almost relieved, as if they'd known this was coming and had welcomed it. One of them, the man who'd spoken to Michael 10 years ago, had managed to speak before fading completely. He'd said that Millbrook Valley was shutting down, that the field generator was losing power, and that soon the spatial bubble would collapse and everyone inside would be returned to their proper places and times. Michael had asked what would happen to the watching people, whether they'd be returned to their families and their lives. The man had smiled sadly and had said that they'd been in Millbrook Valley too long, had been integrated into the field so thoroughly that they couldn't exist outside it. When the town shut down, the watching people would shut down with it, would finally find the peace that had been denied them for so many years. And then they were gone. All of the watching people, more than 100 souls who'd been trapped for years or decades, had simply ceased to exist as Millbrook Valley powered down around them. The buildings had continued to age and decay rapidly, collapsing into ruin before Michael's eyes. The streets had cracked and broken, weeds sprouting up through the pavement with impossible speed. The golden light had faded to gray and then to darkness, and the team had found themselves standing in the ruins of a ghost town that looked like it had been abandoned for a century. The fog had cleared completely, and Michael had been able to see that they were still in Northern California, but in a location that was slightly different from where they'd entered. The spatial bubble had been small, had only encompassed a few square miles, but within that space, Millbrook Valley had existed as a trap that had claimed hundreds of lives over what must have been many decades. The team had documented everything, had photographed and recorded the ruins and the field generator that still sat beneath the gazebo, now dark and inert. They'd taken samples of the technology, had packaged up what they could carry, and then they'd left, driving out of the ruins through passages that were now just normal forest roads leading back to ordinary highways. The journey back to civilization had been surreal. They'd emerged onto Highway 5 in the early morning hours, and everything had been normal, traffic flowing, people going about their daily routines, completely unaware that just a few miles away, a pocket universe that had been trapping people for decades had finally shut down. Michael had felt a mixture of relief and profound sadness. They'd freed the watching people, but only by letting them die or cease to exist or whatever had happened when the field generator had lost power. In the weeks following the expedition, Michael and his team had analyzed their findings and had prepared reports on what they discovered. The technology behind Millbrook Valley had been far more advanced than anything currently publicly available, which suggested either a classified government project or something even more exotic. The researchers had dated some of the structural components and had concluded that the field generator had been built sometime in the early 1900s, which aligned with Millbrook Valley's purported founding date of 1893. Someone had created this trap more than a century ago, had built a device that could create pocket universes and sustain them by feeding on human suffering. Why they'd done this, what purpose it had served, remained a mystery. Perhaps it had been an experiment that had gone wrong, or perhaps it had always been meant as a trap, a way to study human behavior under conditions of extreme stress, a testing ground for technologies that would later be used for other purposes. What was clear was that Millbrook Valley hadn't been the only such place. The technology could be replicated, could be deployed in different locations, could create multiple pocket universes that operated according to similar rules. And if one had been built in the late 1800s, how many others might exist, scattered across the country or the world, still trapping unwary travelers who took wrong turns on foggy nights? Michael had tried to take his findings to official authorities, to government agencies and research institutions that might have the resources to investigate further. But everywhere he'd gone, he'd been met with skepticism or outright dismissal. The samples of technology they'd recovered were interesting, the officials had admitted, but without being able to reproduce the phenomenon or locate the site again, there was no way to verify Michael's claims. The whole thing could be an elaborate hoax, carefully staged photographs and manufactured evidence designed to gain attention or funding. Only a few people in the intelligence community had taken Michael seriously, had suggested off the record that there were classified projects dating back to the early 20th century that matched some of what he'd described. But they'd also warned him that pursuing this line of investigation could be dangerous, that there were organizations with an interest in keeping certain technologies secret, organizations that had resources and reach that extended far beyond what normal citizens could imagine. Michael had taken those warnings seriously, had scaled back his public research, had shifted his focus from trying to expose the truth to simply helping people who'd had similar experiences. The Lost Towns Project had become a support network more than an investigative organization, a place where survivors could share their stories without fear of ridicule, where they could find others who understood what they'd been through. But Michael had never stopped thinking about those watching people, about the 100-plus souls who'd faded away when Millbrook Valley shut down, who'd spent years or decades trapped in that impossible place before finally finding release in oblivion. He'd wondered about their families, about the people who'd reported them missing, who'd never gotten closure, who'd spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. So Michael had done something that he knew was probably futile but felt necessary anyway. He'd compiled a list of everyone the watching people had identified themselves as during those brief moments of freedom, had cross-referenced it with missing persons databases, and had started contacting families. Not to give them hope that their loved ones were still alive somewhere, because that would have been a cruel lie, but to give them closure, to let them know that their missing family members hadn't suffered, hadn't been victims of violence or cruelty, had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some families had been grateful, had thanked Michael for giving them answers even if those answers weren't what they'd hoped for. Others had been angry, had accused him of exploiting their grief or making up stories about their loved ones. But a few, a small number, had believed him completely, had said they'd always known something impossible had happened, that the official explanations for their family members' disappearance had never made sense. One of those families had been the Hendersons, whose daughter Lisa had vanished in 1997 while driving from Seattle to San Francisco. She'd been 23 years old, a recent college graduate with her whole life ahead of her, and she'd simply disappeared somewhere in Northern California with no trace ever found. Her parents had searched for years, had hired private investigators, had never stopped hoping she'd come home someday. When Michael had contacted them and had told them what he'd learned about Millbrook Valley, about the watching people, about how Lisa had been trapped there for more than 2 decades before the town had finally shut down, they'd wept. Not tears of grief, though there was grief, but tears of relief. Because finally, after 26 years of not knowing, they had an answer. Their daughter hadn't been murdered or kidnapped or involved in some accident where her body was never recovered. She'd been trapped in an impossible place, and she'd eventually been freed, and now they could let go of the hope that had been keeping them in limbo for more than half their lives. The Hendersons had become some of Michael's strongest supporters in the Lost Towns Project, had helped him reach out to other families, had shared their story publicly despite knowing most people would think they were delusional or gullible. They'd said it didn't matter what others thought, that what mattered was that they finally had closure, finally understood what had happened to their daughter. But there was still one question that haunted Michael, that kept him awake some nights even years after Millbrook Valley had shut down. The field generator they'd found, the technology that had created the pocket universe and sustained it for more than a century, had been just one device. The researchers who'd analyzed it had estimated that with the right resources and knowledge, similar devices could be built, could be deployed anywhere, could create an unlimited number of these traps. So how many were still out there? How many Millbrook Valleys existed, scattered across rural roads and forgotten highways, catching travelers who took wrong turns on foggy nights? How many people were trapped in those places right now, standing motionless on perfect streets, watching as new visitors arrived and failed to escape? Michael didn't have answers, and he'd come to accept that he might never find all the places, might never free all the trapped people. What he could do was warn others, could maintain the Lost Towns Project as a resource for travelers who encountered these impossible places, could share the knowledge that had allowed his family to escape. The advice remained the same. If you find yourself in a town that feels too perfect, too clean, too empty, leave immediately. Don't try to understand it, don't try to explore it, just turn around and drive away. If you find you can't leave, if the roads loop back on themselves and the fog won't let you through, then stop seeking escape. Find acceptance, find peace, starve the trap of the fear it needs to sustain itself. And if you encounter watching people, speak to them with compassion, treat them as fellow prisoners rather than threats, because they might be the key to your own freedom. Michael had added one more piece of advice based on his second visit to Millbrook Valley. If you do manage to escape, if you find yourself back in the normal world after being trapped in one of these places, don't go back. Don't try to help those who are still trapped. Don't risk yourself trying to shut down the machinery that keeps these places running. Because the cost might be too high, the sacrifice too great, and you might end up trapped yourself with no one left who knows how to free you. It wasn't heroic advice, wasn't the kind of message that made you feel good about yourself. But it was practical advice, survival advice, the kind of wisdom Michael had learned from decades of close calls and narrow escapes. Sometimes the best thing you could do was survive, was get yourself and your family to safety, and let someone else worry about saving the world. Sarah had certainly agreed with that assessment. She'd made Michael promise, after his second visit to Millbrook Valley, that he'd never go back again, that he'd focus on their family and their life rather than on impossible towns and trapped people. Michael had made that promise and had kept it, had poured his energy into being a good father and husband, had watched his children grow up and build their own lives. But he'd also maintained the Lost Towns Project, had continued documenting encounters and offering advice, had built a community of survivors who supported each other through the long process of recovery and integration. The website had thousands of visitors each month, people searching for answers about strange experiences they'd had, researchers studying anomalous phenomena, family members of missing persons looking for any explanation that might make sense of inexplicable disappearances. And every few months, someone new would contact Michael with a story about a town they'd found that didn't appear on any maps, a place with perfect buildings and empty streets and fog that wouldn't let them leave. Sometimes these people had escaped, had managed to find acceptance, or had been helped by watching people who'd retained enough humanity to assist newcomers. Sometimes they were still trapped, were sending messages from inside these impossible places, begging for help that Michael couldn't provide because he didn't know where they were or how to reach them. Each of these messages had broken Michael's heart a little more, had reminded him that for all his research and documentation, for all the people he'd helped with his advice and support, there were still countless others trapped in places beyond reach, beyond help, beyond hope. The Lost Towns Project had saved some people, had given closure to some families, but it couldn't save everyone, couldn't close every trap, couldn't undo the damage that had been done over more than a century. One evening, 15 years after his family's escape from Millbrook Valley, Michael had been working late in his home office, updating the website with a new report from a survivor in Oregon, when his computer had chimed with an incoming email. The sender had been listed only as administrator, and the subject line had read, "Final warning." Michael had hesitated before opening it, had wondered if this was spam or a virus or something more sinister. But curiosity had won out, and he'd clicked on the message. What he'd read had chilled him to his core. The email had been brief and formal, written in language that suggested legal or official origin. It had stated that Michael's activities with the Lost Towns Project had been noted by certain parties with an interest in maintaining public order and national security. While his intentions were presumably good, his continued dissemination of information about spatial anomalies and pocket universes was creating unnecessary public concern and potentially revealing classified information. The email had gone on to say that Michael was being given a one-time courtesy warning to cease all activities related to the Lost Towns Project, to shut down the website, to stop contacting families of missing persons, and to discontinue any research or investigation into anomalous geographic phenomena. If he complied with this warning, no further action would be taken. If he continued his activities, he would face consequences that the email didn't specify but strongly implied would be severe. Michael had stared at that email for a long time, had felt a mixture of fear and anger and frustration. After everything he'd been through, after surviving Millbrook Valley and helping his family escape and building a resource that had helped dozens of other people, someone in some government agency or private organization had decided he was a problem that needed to be shut down. He'd shown the email to Sarah, and she'd been unequivocal in her response. "Shut it down," she'd said. "Close the website, stop the research, walk away before whoever sent that email decided to escalate from warnings to actions." They had a good life, had raised their children successfully, had moved past the trauma of their experience. Why risk all of that to continue documenting something that most people didn't believe in anyway? Michael had known she was right, had known that the smart thing, the safe thing, was to comply with the warning and move on with his life. But he'd also thought about all the people who were still trapped in places like Millbrook Valley, all the families who were still searching for missing loved ones, all the future travelers who might take wrong turns on foggy nights and find themselves in impossible towns. In the end, Michael had compromised. He'd shut down the public website, had removed all the documentation and reports and advice he'd accumulated over the years, but he'd also created a private network, a password-protected forum accessible only to confirmed survivors and their families, a place where information could still be shared, but without the public visibility that had apparently triggered the warning. He'd sent messages to everyone in the Lost Towns project community, had explained what had happened, and had provided access to the new private forum. Some people had understood and had followed him to the private space. Others had been angry, had accused him of giving in to pressure and abandoning the mission. A few had simply disappeared, had stopped responding to messages, and Michael had wondered if they'd received similar warnings, or if something worse had happened to them. The private forum had been smaller, more intimate than the public website had been. But it had continued serving its purpose, had continued connecting survivors and sharing information and offering support. Michael had been more careful about what was posted there, had avoided anything that might be considered classified information, had focused on practical advice and emotional support rather than investigation and documentation. Years had passed, and the warnings had not been repeated. Whatever organization or agency had sent that email seemed satisfied that Michael had scaled back his activities sufficiently to no longer be a concern. Life had returned to something approaching normal, or at least as normal as life could be for someone who'd experienced what the Chen family had experienced. Emma had finished her degree in psychology and had started working with trauma survivors, specializing in cases involving unusual or difficult-to-explain experiences. She'd never explicitly told her clients about Millbrook Valley, had maintained professional boundaries, but Michael had known that her own experience informed her work in ways that made her more effective at helping people who'd been through things that traditional therapy wasn't equipped to address. Daniel had become a successful artist, had exhibitions in galleries across California, had developed a reputation for surrealist paintings that captured feelings of displacement and unreality. Critics had praised his work for its emotional depth and technical skill, never knowing that the uncanny buildings and impossible streets he painted were based on places he'd actually seen as a child, places that had marked him permanently. Michael and Sarah had grown older together, had watched their children build their own lives, had accumulated the ordinary joys and sorrows of long-term marriage and middle age. They'd traveled sometimes, though always carefully, always staying on major highways, always avoiding foggy roads and GPS suggestions that seemed too good to be true. They'd built a good life despite the trauma in their past, or maybe because of it, because surviving something impossible had taught them to appreciate the ordinary miracles of daily existence. But Michael had never forgotten the watching people of Millbrook Valley, the souls who'd been trapped for years or decades before finally finding release when the town shut down. He'd carried their memory with him, had honored their sacrifice by continuing to help others even when it became dangerous to do so. They'd given his family their freedom, and Michael had tried to pay that gift forward however he could. On the 20th anniversary of their escape from Millbrook Valley, Michael and Sarah had driven back to Northern California, to the area where they'd first encountered that impossible town. They hadn't been looking for Millbrook Valley itself, hadn't tried to find the entrance or locate the ruins of the field generator. They'd simply wanted to mark the occasion somehow, to acknowledge what they'd survived and what they'd lost. They'd driven on Highway 5 just as they had 20 years before, had taken the same exit they'd taken back then, had followed rural roads into the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. But this time there'd been no fog, no GPS malfunction, no turn onto Forest Service Road 47. Just normal roads through normal countryside, beautiful in its ordinariness, peaceful in its reality. They'd stopped at a rest area overlooking a valley that might or might not have been the location where Millbrook Valley had existed. The landscape looked different in daylight without fog, and Michael hadn't been sure if this was the right place or just somewhere nearby. But it didn't matter, not really. What mattered was taking a moment to remember, to honor the people they'd met in that impossible place, to acknowledge the experience that had changed their family forever. Sarah had taken Michael's hand as they'd stood there looking out over the valley, and she'd said something that Michael had never forgotten. She'd said that maybe Millbrook Valley had been a gift in its own strange way, had taught them things about themselves and each other that they never would have learned otherwise. It had shown them how strong they were, how much they were willing to fight for each other, how they could survive impossible situations through cooperation and compassion. Michael had agreed, though he'd also added that he'd have preferred to learn those lessons some other way. Some way that didn't involve weeks of terror and the sacrifice of 100 trapped souls. Sarah had smiled at that, had said yes, obviously, but since they couldn't change what had happened, they might as well find meaning in it, might as well use the experience to make themselves better people rather than letting it destroy them. They'd stood there for a while longer, watching the sunlight move across the valley, listening to the wind in the trees, feeling the solid reality of the ground beneath their feet. And then they'd gotten back in their car and had driven home, back to San Jose, back to their ordinary life, back to the normal world where towns appeared on maps and roads led to actual destinations and fog was just water vapor rather than a gateway to impossible places. But Michael had known, had accepted, that some part of him would always be in Millbrook Valley, would always be standing on those perfect streets surrounded by watching people, trying to solve the puzzle of how to escape from a place that shouldn't exist. That experience had marked him permanently, had changed something fundamental about how he understood reality and possibility. He could never go back to seeing the world the way he had before, could never fully believe in the solidity and reliability of normal existence. And maybe that was okay. Maybe carrying that knowledge, that uncertainty, that awareness that reality was more fragile and strange than most people imagined, maybe that was the price of survival. Maybe everyone who escaped from places like Millbrook Valley carried similar scars, similar knowledge, similar awareness that the world was bigger and stranger than it appeared. The Lost Towns Project private forum had continued operating for another 5 years before Michael had finally decided it was time to let it go. The community had dwindled, survivors had moved on with their lives. New encounters with impossible towns had become less frequent or at least less reported. Michael had posted a final message explaining that he was retiring from active involvement, that he was passing administrative duties to a younger member of the community who'd had their own experience with a lost town in Vermont. Michael had kept the documentation, though, had preserved everything he'd learned over 2 decades of research and investigation. He'd created multiple backups, had stored copies in different locations, had made arrangements for the information to be released publicly if anything happened to him. It was insurance, a way to ensure that even if he was silenced, the knowledge would survive, would be available to future travelers who found themselves in impossible situations. And then, finally, Michael had truly moved on. He'd focused on his family, his work, his ordinary life. He'd spent time with Emma and Daniel, had become a grandfather when Emma had her first child, had watched his family grow and evolve. He'd traveled with Sarah to places they'd always wanted to visit, had accumulated new memories to balance out the old trauma. But sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Michael would find himself thinking about Millbrook Valley. He'd remember the watching people, the impossible streets, the fog that wouldn't let them leave. He'd remember Emma's terror and Daniel's tears, Sarah's strength and his own desperation. He'd remember the bronze plaque in the gazebo, with its cryptic warning about seeking and remaining and watching. And he'd remember the moment when they'd escaped, when the car had finally broken through the fog barrier and emerged into normal reality. That moment of transition, of crossing from impossible back to possible, had been the most profound relief Michael had ever experienced. It had been like being born again, like waking from a nightmare into a world where physics worked properly and geography made sense and towns appeared on maps. Sometimes Michael wondered if other versions of his family were still trapped in Millbrook Valley, if the town had splintered their timeline into multiple paths, some leading to escape and others to permanent imprisonment. He'd read enough about quantum mechanics and parallel universes to know that such things were theoretically possible, that maybe somewhere in some other iteration of reality, Michael Chen was still standing on a perfect street surrounded by watching people, still trying to solve the puzzle of escape. But in this reality, in this timeline, he'd made it out. His family had survived. They'd gone on to live full and meaningful lives despite the trauma they'd endured. And that had to be enough, had to be the happy ending even if it wasn't the perfectly satisfying conclusion that stories usually had. Because real life didn't work like stories. Real life had loose ends and unanswered questions and mysteries that never got solved. Real life had impossibilities that happened anyway, had rules that got broken, had places that existed outside the normal boundaries of space and time. And the best you could do was survive those impossibilities, learn what you could from them, and try to help others who encountered similar situations. That's what Michael had done. That's what the Lost Towns Project had been about. Not saving everyone, not solving every mystery, not eliminating every impossible town, but simply making survival more likely for those who encountered them. Simple advice, hard-won wisdom, a community of people who understood what you'd been through because they'd been through similar experiences themselves. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could do in the face of impossibilities, in a world where reality was stranger and more fragile than most people realized. Survive, remember, help others survive. Simple goals, but profound in their impact, life-saving in their application. Michael Chun had survived Millbrook Valley. His family had survived. And through their survival and the knowledge they'd shared, other people had survived too. Not everyone, not all the watching people, not all the travelers who'd taken wrong turns on foggy nights, but some. Enough to matter. Enough to make the effort worthwhile. As Michael grew older, as he approached retirement and contemplated the legacy he'd leave behind, he thought about writing a book about Millbrook Valley, about documenting everything in a form that might reach people who'd never visit a website or join an online community. But he'd also remembered the warning email, remembered the implied threats, and had decided that maybe some knowledge was better kept quiet, better shared in whispers among those who already understood. Instead, he'd told his story to his grandchildren, had sat them down when they were old enough to understand, and had explained what had happened to their mother and uncle when they were children, what had happened to their grandparents, what they'd survived together. The grandchildren had listened with wide eyes, had asked if it was true, had